Presentation of dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
Coming up on a special hour-long edition of Dialogue, we look at how former foes became friends as they spent 8 years working on a bill to protect the Owyhee Canyonlands of southern Idaho. That's Dialogue next. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. A welcome as well to those of you listening on public radio and the World Wide Web. The opposition, wrote Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist Walter Lippmann, is indispensable. A good statesman, he continued, like any other sensible human being, always learns more from his opponents than from his fervent supporters. My guests today represent that philosophy in action. Although they come from disparate backgrounds and political views, they have a common goal: the protection of one of Idaho's natural treasures, the Owyhee Canyonlands area. It's been called the Big Quiet. Covering millions of acres on the border with Nevada, the region combines a vast sagebrush sea with jagged rhyolite towers soaring over deep canyons. It's a big country with multiple uses, from ranching to recreation, from sacred tribal sites to military airspace. Now, much of the area was tied up in wilderness study designation for decades, frustrating both locals and visitors who weren't sure what they could do and where. But as of March 30th, when President Obama signed an Omnibus Lands Management Act for our country, there's now a roadmap, so to speak, for the Owyahees. That includes the first formal wilderness designation in Idaho in nearly 30 years. Today we'll talk with the parties who came together to make that happen. They'll discuss not only what will change on the ground, but how the negotiation process worked and whether it can be used for other controversial issues in our state and around the country. And we'll take your phone calls. Do you enjoy the Owyhee Canyonlands area? What questions do you have about the pending changes? Give us a call at 1-800-973-9800. Now, let me introduce my guests. Joining us from Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. is Senator Mike Crapo, who sponsored the legislation. Senator, thanks for joining us at what I know is a late hour for you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real treat to be able to join you tonight.
Well, hopefully we'll hear him in just a moment. We can't hear him in the studio, but here in our Boise studio is Fred Grant. Mr. Grant is the chair of the Owyhee Initiative Work Group that drafted the legislation. Welcome to you.
Thank you, Marcia.
Also here is Craig Gehrke, the Executive Director of the Wilderness Society in Idaho. Thanks for being here.
Sure.
Joining us is Ted Howard, the Cultural Resources Director of the Shoshone Pauite Tribes. I appreciate you driving up from Duck Valley.
Thank you.
And also here is Bill Taylor of the Idaho State 4x4 Association. Welcome.
Thank you, Marcia.
And last but certainly not least is Brenda Richards of the Owyhee Borderlands Trust, a ranching group. Nice to see you. Now, Ms. Richards is also the Owyhee treasurer, the county treasurer, I meant to say. Sorry about that. Now, before we begin, let's take a look at some of the main aspects of the Owyhee Initiative legislation. It designates 517,000 acres as wilderness and 315 miles of rivers as wild and scenic. 190,000 acres are released from wilderness study. The law closes 200 miles of roads but legalizes permanent access on other roads. It enables the Shoshone Pauite Tribes to protect their culturally significant and sacred sites. Private land exchanges and acquisitions would be authorized in order to consolidate wilderness areas and shift grazing land. The bill also establishes a rangeland science review process and a research and conservation center to deal with ongoing issues such as the sage-grouse listing. Now, how to pay for all this? Well, the legislation anticipates that Congress will appropriate $15 million and that conservation groups will raise at least an additional $10 million. Again, we're discussing the recent federal law passed that would change the way land is managed in the Owyhee Canyonlands area of southern Idaho. Do you have a question or comment? Call us at 1-800-973-9800. Senator Crapo, let me go first to you, and hopefully we can hear you in the studio now. You were there the day that this legislation was signed by President Obama. What was that day like for you?
Well, that was really a rewarding day. You can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. It was really a rewarding and an exciting day, and although I had the opportunity with many other Idahoans and members of the Owyhee Initiative Work Group to be there, I really have to turn the thanks back to the people of Idaho for the character and integrity that they showed, and the members of the work group who literally put in blood, sweat, and tears for 8 years to make this a reality.
You know, Senator, many people didn't think that this would happen, and you've even joked about that. The legislation had been languishing for some time in Congress. At one event I went to, you thanked Democrat leader Senator Harry Reid for his help on this. Do you think that this bill would have passed if it were not for the fact that there's a Democratic majority now? Do you think that helped?
Well, actually, I think that the Democratic majority was very instrumental in making this bill come to a reality. But had the Republicans been in charge, I think it would have passed too. And what I'm really getting at there is not to say that I'm trying to spread the thanks between both parties. I'm trying to point out the fact that the collaborative effort that we went through in Idaho on this built common ground and consensus among all parties, so that it really didn't matter which party was in control of Congress, because we had the broad support from every perspective that was able to help build and push forward this effort, no matter what the political dynamics were.
We see you here with President Obama as he's about to sign the legislation, and quite a crowd around him. This is part of an omnibus lands management package. Other bills were in here. Before we move to our other guests, Senator, why was this legislation so important to you that you kept working on it and kept encouraging the committee to work on it? What about it was so important to you?
Well, Marcia, 2 or 3 reasons. First, this is one of the most precious and special parts of Idaho, and we have a lot of really precious and special places in Idaho. But this is one where we've had some conflict for decades now over different competing uses of this incredible place. And it was important to resolve these issues in a way that benefited everybody. In addition, though, as you know, I'm a strong advocate of the collaborative process. And we had people in this area who were willing to come away from the litigation table to the collaborating table and to sit down together and to develop the personal relationships and the personal confidence and the understanding of the issues that would enable them to build a win-win solution for everybody. And by doing so, we've really set a pattern, in my opinion, for public land management decisions and conflict resolution for the whole country.
Well, let's talk to some of those folks. Fred Grant, here in Boise, you were chair of the working group that looked at this issue for so many years. We have footage of you with Senator Crapo at the celebratory signing down well, actually this one was in Boise, but there was also one in Murphy, Idaho. This hasn't been an easy process at times, and you've been involved in the public lands movement for a while, property rights movement. At times there were people on your side of the aisle who called you a traitor.
Still to this day, it wasn't just at times. Pretty much the whole private property inside the Beltway groups considered that I deserted them, but that's all right. We got it accomplished, and what we got accomplished for the ranchers and for the people of Idaho and Owyhee County in particular makes it worth it.
We see some of the diverse groups here at this celebratory signing. What made this so important for you to work on? You had worked for, say, the late Representative Helen Chenoweth on property rights issues. Again, very different from collaborating with environmentalists. Why did you want to do this? What was Owyhee County looking at?
Well, 18 years ago, the ranchers in Owyhee County were looking at a 40% reduction in grazing. And we put into place a coordination process with the BLM where we were able to forestall that. But we never got to the place where the ranchers were free from the litigation table. You just can't imagine, it's not just in money, the millions of dollars that were spent, but the time and the energy that was sheer waste by trying and litigating cases and fighting with people like Craig and his groups. And it was a matter, I thought, of the future, hoping that we could get something resolved so that the ranchers could get about the business of ranching.
Is that your sense? You come from a ranching family, and you're with the Owyhee Borderlands Trust, other ranchers as well, and you're involved in this work group. Was your way of life being threatened, and will this help?
Yes, I truly believe that this group has come together We've been through some hard times and we've been through some really good times. And one of the most interesting things was, whether it's ranching, whether it's recreation, or whether it's an environmental concern, we all want to preserve that beautiful place out there. And we're firm believers in multiple use, and this comes together and brings a number of issues to some strategies that we can all work on. Owyhee Borderlands Trust is very interested in doing some conservation projects that will help the landscape out there and the ranching community, and we really got some good partners. We've got a really good network working together, and there's a good understanding that came from trying to realize what everyone's trying to do out there.
Now, the bill did have to be modified somewhat for the support by the Democrats in terms of, as I understand it, specific payments to specific ranchers. But part of the whole process is that ranchers will be paid eventually for land to be withdrawn. Is that correct?
Correct. There's some land that will be withdrawn. There's some exchange aspect. There's a number of things that were put together by the individual ranchers in cooperation with this work group to make the package work. And that's what we're going forward with. Everybody's behind it. It's by far not going to be, easy to complete, but none of this has been, easy, but it's definitely been a dream, and we're fulfilling it, and so we're ready to see it through, and it will make these ranches whole, and it will enable them to stay in the ranching business.
Whole by moving to another area, by trading land?
Yes, some of them will trade land out. There will be some of the area that has actually a cowless or non-grazed areas, and these were all items that were put together by the individual ranches and that were accepted by the work group and makes this work, so yes.
Craig Gehrke, you worked on this from the Wilderness Society for many years, and same question to you in a way that I asked Mr. Grant. I mean, there were people in the conservation movement who felt that giving up anything was not a good idea, to put it mildly. And what do you, let's take a look at the map first of all. I think this would be a good time to show the big map so that we can talk about what we're viewing here. And we can see here the areas in the dark green are new wilderness areas. New wilderness areas. The areas in the yellow have been withdrawn from wilderness study. So that's, I guess, what you might say concession on the part of the environmental groups. Why was it worth it?
Well, I think that from our standpoint, I think we got some of the very best country protected as wilderness here. And it was also worth it in just the county buy-in. I mean, this wasn't anything that was done to Owyhee County. Owyhee County worked on these boundaries, and these boundaries for the wild scenic rivers and wilderness areas were done by everybody around this table and others, so that we came to something that met as much as people's needs as we could.
Literally creek by creek.
Pretty much.
Road by road.
And the lands that are up for exchange, we went and looked at each one of those exchange areas. We went and talked about that, talked about the non-grazed areas. So it's not surprising it took as long as it did, because we were kind of learning what we were doing as we went along. But I think, you mentioned up front, it's a big country, and there's a lot of country to look at. And we probably also knew we would get one chance at this. We couldn't, get angry and walk away and then try to come back again. So we decided we better stick with this, even when the going got tough. And for those who've been down the country, it's certainly worth the 8 years of effort to get this country, which is very special for Idaho, protected as wilderness.
And we have some beautiful footage of that we'll be showing from our program Outdoor Idaho as we continue talking. Bill Taylor from the 4x4 Association, one of the controversial issues here is access to this area, roads, driving. People have created roads over time, and they want to still be able to use them. But 200 miles of these, I don't know what you'd call them, spider web roads will now be closed. Why was that okay in your mind as a member of the work group to close some of these roads? I believe we've got some footage of how hard the driving is in this country.
Well, that's not an issue with the 4x4.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can go pretty much, well, we try to go anywhere, but we try to stay within the parameters of the roads. A lot of these roads that were accessible or been used as access has been WSAs all along.
Wilderness study areas.
Wilderness study areas already. And really, in the basic fact, we didn't have access to them anyways. So that was hard to come across, especially with those that have grown up in the area, that have used these for a couple of decades, and so they don't understand that as far as how that has come across, as far as that these roads have to be closed, because it was indeed wilderness study areas. So
but there still will be access points.
There'll still be access.
Open. There's some very well-known ones for those of you out there. Crutcher's Crossing will still be open. Indian Hot Springs Road will still be open. So there's still some areas that will be open. It's just basically the canyon rims. You don't want people driving across the canyon rims as much anymore, right?
What the benefit, I think, is the multiple use of all the release of the WSA's wilderness study areas that will be released because of this document, of the legislation. I think that's a big plus, that we were able to have that part of it.
Why?
Well, it just gives us more area. We couldn't go to those areas in the first place, okay, because it was a wilderness study area. Okay, now we have, I don't know if you'd say a legal right, but we still, as public lands as multiple use now we have that ability to use those and use those roads that are there.
Ted Howard, I want to talk with you. You're with the Shoshone Pauite Tribes. Part of this legislation will enable your tribe to help manage this travel plan and make sure people are not going places that they shouldn't be, because they are of cultural significance and even sacred sites for your tribe.
That's correct. The Shoshone and Pauite people have thousands of years of history in this area, and there are many sites that continue to be important to our people and for the cultural survival and continuance of our people. And we're happy to be a part of this group, and also our community is a ranching community, so we relate to a lot of the things that's happening with our friends in Owyhee County.
Talk a little bit about the significance of this area. I know I've heard you describe it as a graveyard, and a sacred graveyard for your peoples.
Yes, and also the Owyhee River used to be the spawning grounds for anadromous fish, for salmon and such, so there are many fishing sites along the river. But in the mid-1800s, late 1800s, there was a lot of battles that took place in the Owyhee Canyonlands. In fact, that's an area where our people took refuge in, because it's such a rough country, and the cavalry had a difficult time getting them in there. But in the meantime, there were many people killed and buried, still buried in that area.
Well, I want to talk more about the process, and we'll come back to the senator in just a moment, but let's take some phone calls. Nathaniel in Blackfoot. Nathaniel, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I got a question, folks.
Go ahead.
Is after you get this YE wilderness done, can we expect this wilderness craziness to be ended? Because in '74, when Church's wilderness deal, we were promised there'd be no more wilderness in Idaho. And as a person of Idaho for almost 56 years, I'm tired of being ran out of my hunting area by denying access.
Okay, good point. Let's get an answer for you. Thank you very much. What's your sense? Senator, I'm going to go back to you. We've got the Boulder White Clouds legislation on tap that's sponsored by Representative Simpson. This gentleman feels like there shouldn't be any more wilderness, that this should be the end of it. What's your sense?
Well, you know, there are very, very strong feelings in Idaho about our public land management, and they range all the way from those who feel there should be no more wilderness designations in Idaho, to those who feel that there should be no more grazing in Idaho, or no more multiple use in many different contexts of the land, and all sorts of different positions in between. And the bottom line, in my opinion, is that these areas have been designated by law as wilderness study areas, both in the Owyhees and in the Boulder White Clouds and other areas in Idaho for decades now. And the management of wilderness study areas, as has already been mentioned here, is actually in many ways much more restrictive than the wilderness itself. And I frankly think that the message of this collaboration is that we can come together. I believe that every interest group that you've just talked to, plus the other interests in the management of this land who are a part of the work group, are better off than they under this legislation than they were under the status quo. And the message here is that we can build win-win solutions with buy-in from people of all different perspectives if we will sit down at the table and work with each other's concerns and build this consensus.
Senator, I'm going to read an op-ed or part of an op-ed from Representative Lenore Barrett, with whom you've worked in, she's in the State House here, and the title of which was, "We Must Stop Collaborating with Wacko Enviros." She says, Idaho is a natural resource state, not a tourist mecca or a federal preserve. Idaho's congressionals should concentrate their efforts on restoring Idaho's natural resource industries and stop collaborating with the environmental pantheists who destroyed Idaho's rural economy. Why not just give Idaho back, she says, to the federal government and get it over with? This is somebody, again, from your own party.
I know Lenore, and she's a good friend. We simply disagree on this issue. And I come back to what I just said. Often when we approach environmental conflict in areas like the Boulder White Clouds or the Owyhees, people believe that it's a win-lose proposition, that either the economy must suffer or that the environment must suffer. But one of the most incredible things about the Owyhee Initiative and the success that we've had there is that we proved that if instead of fighting in court or fighting in political arenas, we will come together, learn to know each other and to know each other's interests and objectives, that we can literally identify solutions that are better for the economy, better for the environment, and better for the interests of all of the parties who are battling over these tremendous and wonderful places than the status quo. And so my point is, it's not an either-or situation, as Lenore suggested, in my opinion. We can, and in fact we did in the Owyhees, find a way to get a win for those who are part of our natural resource economy and a win for those who want to preserve this wonderful place forever for our children and grandchildren.
Senator, I know we're going to lose you at the half hour with the satellite feed. I want to ask you, what do you think the prospects are for the Boulder White Clouds legislation?
Well, any legislation, wilderness legislation, in fact I call it public land management legislation, because there are so many pieces to this other than just the wilderness piece. But any piece like that is going to face some very, very difficult times in any Congress. Having said that, the Boulder White Cloud legislation has also proceeded along a pathway of identifying win-win solutions for all parties involved. And I think that to the extent that we can complete that process on the Boulder White Clouds, that there's a real possibility that we can once again find a path forward, and I repeat, a path forward that is better for the natural resource economy, that is better for the ranchers and those who make their living off of the land in that area, and is better for those who have other objectives, whether it be hunting or outfitting and guides or off-road vehicle use or the preservation of the land.
Well, you're talking about people making their living off the land. I want to go to a close-up of one of these maps. It's the Little Jacks Creek Wilderness and the Big Jacks Creek Wilderness, if we could put that up on the screen. The reason I want to show this is that you'll see some cross-hatching on this map in the green area. And Craig Gehrke, this is area that, and Brenda, this is area that's been designated wilderness now by this law, but is still going to remain in grazing until the conservation groups can come up with money to buy out the ranchers or work out land trades. Mm-hmm. How practicable is that, do you think?
Well, I think it's very doable. I think Brenda mentioned up front that it's going to be hard, but every step of this has been hard. I think to note that basically grazing has always been allowed in wilderness areas by the 1964 Act, and that the proposed areas proposed for non-grazing, this is all on a voluntary basis. Nobody was coerced into this. Ranchers came forward and said, we would agree to this if you come in and buy our grazing facilities out of here. And that's one of the big commitments for the coming months, is to begin to raise that private money to acquire, to carefully, methodically fulfill these agreements.
So you'll have to go to private foundations, private individuals, yeah, and then you'll have to value the land as well.
Correct. I think Craig hits a really good point that's very unique, and that is one of our points we need to tout for this Owyhee initiative. Every one of these pieces was brought forward for the work group and by the ranchers. And even though, as Craig says, this may be a little bit challenging to have this grazing in this area or non-grazed, it's something that we all agreed would happen. We'll work to make it happen. And the commitment is there to participate, to get the funding together for the land exchanges.
Why don't the ranchers mind giving up this land?
Because they actually were sitting at the table and contributed, and there was concessions on all sides for what would work to keep their ranching. And there may be some trade-offs, there may be some buyouts of different aspects, and it still comes down to what, when we got into tough times, what we would throw out there is what we want the landscape to look like way down the road.
There's always been controversy about paying ranchers for what some people perceive as public grazing privileges, not rights, that they're not property rights, that they're privileges, so they shouldn't be paid for them.
Correct. That's always a controversial aspect. If you purchase a ranch with a grazing permit, that is valued because the base property is only as valuable as a ranching unit with that permit. So it's a little bit dicey, but there's also, it was a very good educational aspect too, because that's one of the things we need to help people understand is we are out there protecting wildlife, helping the landscape, helping the environment, those type of things too. So it's a win-win situation to keep the livelihood out there instead of chopping up the home place, into segments. But it's also a fact that we're strong advocates of multiple use. We may have a grazing permit out there, but we also realize that it's fully open to other uses. And grazing in wilderness is not a new concept. There has been grazing in wilderness. It may take a little bit of modification, but it's very doable.
Okay, let's try and get one more call in before the senator leaves. Mike in Moore, Idaho, I believe. Mike, go ahead, please.
Okay, I have a question for the senator. Well, what it is there was a newspaper article on the Frank Church wilderness when Frank Church run it through that he had gotten 382 acres deeded to his estate, federal land. What is Senator Crapo getting out of this?
Senator?
Well, first of all, I was not aware of that, and I'm not going to confirm that that did or did not happen, but I can guarantee you that I didn't get any personal gain out of this. The benefit to me out of this was working with the people of Idaho to take, in my opinion, a tremendous step forward, not only for Idaho in this specific wonderful part of our state, but to really be an example to the nation about how we should approach decision-making in very highly conflict-ridden areas of public lands.
Senator, let me ask you a different money question, and this is, where's the money going to come from for this legislation? We've got money that needs to go for land, we've got money to establish a science center. How close are we to getting that appropriation?
Well, I think that roughly you can identify 3 different areas in which the money will need to be raised. First, as has already been mentioned, there will be a significant amount of money raised from the private sector, from private contributions. Secondly, a significant amount of the money will come from the sale of public lands by the Bureau of Land Management. These are parcels of property that the Bureau of Land Management in other places, not in the Owyhees, but in other places, has already identified, and they are releasing those lands to the public sector, if you will, to the private sector, if you will, and the proceeds of the sale of those lands will go into the utilization of functions for
Senator,
this bill. And then finally, there will need to be some direct appropriations by Congress in the appropriations
and how close
process.
How optimistic?
And through all 3 of those efforts, we will get there.
We've got about a minute left before we lose you on the satellite. How optimistic are you of the congressional appropriation piece?
I'm very optimistic. Listen, it's always dangerous to predict victory in a legislative context, but what I can tell you is that we will go at this and stay at this until we succeed, just like the members of the work group did. We will not let this fail for lack of getting the funding. We know that we now have a big responsibility to raise these dollars in each of the 3 areas that I talked about, and we are as committed to making sure that the implementation of the legislation occurs on time as those who work to help us get the legislation passed were committed to their part of the process as well.
Well, Senator Mike Crapo, appearing from Capitol Hill, I appreciate you taking the time. I know that the Senate is in session right now. You need to get back to your work, so I appreciate the time that you have spent with us talking about the Owyhee Initiative. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And again, we are talking about legislation recently signed by President Obama that would designate over 500,000 acres of wilderness in the Owyhee Canyonlands area, but also provides opportunities for multiple use. We're going to talk a little bit more about the process now used to come to a negotiation on that and take some more phone calls. Let's take a phone call from Gary in Hagerman. Gary, go ahead, please.
Yes, I am an avid chucker hunter. And we've looked at the map, and we're being closed out of a lot of access for hunting. I don't know where Senator Crapo is coming from, but I think the ranchers are being paid like $15 million for RS 2477 roads that have been open to the public for years, and now the hunters can't use the same roads that the ranchers get to use for their four-wheelers and pickups. Is this not a fact?
Let's talk to, we've got some nodding heads here. We'll talk to Fred Grant, Chair of the Working Committee, about this. RS 2477 roads, just to clarify,
they're public roads that were created under revised statute 2477 passed in 1866, and none of them have been closed at this point. There's only one way to close those roads under Idaho law, and that's by the county commissioners. First of all, the ranchers have not been paid for those roads. The ranchers, any payments to the ranchers, I want to clarify one thing. Congress is not paying for the buyout of any of the ranching operations. That's the private money that's being raised.
They'll pay for the assessors, maybe, to value the land.
No, the private money will take care. The private money will take care of all of that. We were told early on by the committee that public dollars would not be used for the very reason that you said, because there is a conflict. I happen to believe there are private property rights involved, but there's a conflict over that, and it's a conflict in Congress that we didn't have the power to get around, and so that's the reason we turned to getting the private dollars.
So the ranchers, to answer this gentleman's question, are not getting a better deal than the hunters. In your estimation, they're not going to be able to go on roads that hunters can't go on.
Well, no, unless they're on private property. Ranchers, one of the misconceptions that a lot of hunters have is that there are roads that are on private property that belong to the ranchers, and when they're closed out of those...
Belong to the hunters, you mean?
No, that belong to the ranchers.
Okay.
If a road is on a ranch and it's private property, they don't belong to the hunters. They belong to the ranchers. Those roads will be closed if the rancher decides to close them, but that was always the case.
Talk about this, because a lot of people at 4x4 probably are hunters too. What's your sense of
Well,
whether...
I agree with Fred, because if it's on private property, you know, that's that private property's, that's that owner's road, and we cannot disenfranchise
Gary,
that.
does that answer your question, or was there a specific road you're concerned about?
Not totally, but I got part of the answer I wanted, so thank you very much.
Okay, well, thanks so much for calling. I appreciate it. And let's talk to Ann in Caldwell. Ann, go ahead, please.
Hi, I was just wondering how this is going to help or hinder the wild horses.
Okay, great question. Anyone want to try that?
I don't think it'll help them or hinder them. The wild horses are under a special act of Congress, and the BLM is charged with managing those under its management plan. This bill won't have any impact on that. The BLM's been very cooperative with us in the last 2 to 3 years on this bill, and they will still have to manage the land as they would under any multiple use, and horses are part of that multiple use.
Okay, hopefully that answered your question for you.
Thank you.
We're talking again about the Owyhee Canyonlands Initiative, which designates wilderness area and also multiple use areas. And one of the other things that it does is it allows the Shoshone Pauite Tribes to enforce travel restrictions in some areas that are considered sacred to your tribes. How will you be doing that? Will people start seeing tribal vehicles in the area, or will it be first an education process?
Well, first of all, the tribes aren't closing any roads. It's those roads in the wilderness area that will be closed. Our interest is focused on the protection of cultural sites and sensitive areas. We're going to patrol that from the air, and also we'll have rangers on the ground. So it's not, we're not going to close any roads. I think that needs to be clarified.
How will you, but when you see somebody in an area that you think they shouldn't be in, what will you do?
I imagine we'll have to take that on a case-by-case basis, because if someone is in there, we may have to go in there to arrest them. I don't know, but we'll get to that.
Craig Gehrke, are we in an era now where we're going to see, is there such a thing as a pure wilderness bill anymore? I guess, you know, or are all these compromises just going to be the way things proceed from here on out with wilderness?
Well, I'd argue we never had a pure wilderness bill for Idaho. If you look at the ones we have, including clear back the Wilderness Act, the Sowie Bitterroot, every one of those had a provision in them, whether it was, you know, jet boats on the Salmon River or a cobalt mining area in the Frank Church.
Or airstrips.
Airstrips, jet boats in the Snake River. Everyone has had a compromise in them, and everyone's always going to have a compromise.
I'll ask you the same question I asked the senator. And many people thought that the Boulder White Clouds legislation would be passed into law before this. What do you think accounts for the fact that the Owyhee legislation, I mean, be honest about it. What accounts for it happening?
The Owyhee was certainly, in terms of what wilderness would happen next in Idaho, was certainly the dark horse, because just in conservation circles, always considered the Boulder White Clouds would be the next one, because it had been worked on for many, many years. Yeah. I think there was a momentum going. I think Senator Crapo takes a lot of credit for being our sponsor in the Senate, a senator who gave us his blessing, said he would do anything he could to get us through.
Although Representative Simpson has worked really hard on the Boulder White Clouds legislation.
That's true, he has, and it's just kind of the fact that we came back there with a very diverse group of people for the Owyhees. Everybody here walked the halls of Congress numerous times, and I think that pays off. That shows people that it's not just the environmentalists, it's not just the county commissioners being back there. We had a lot of different people go back and advocate for this, and that catches people's attention.
Fred Grant, did this all start around a table like this, kind of a kitchen table? I know.
Well, actually, the first step was at Hal Tomey's kitchen table in Homedale.
Former commissioner.
Yeah, he was the chairman of the commission. The next step was in a bagel shop in Boise, where I met, hoping that nobody would see me at that time, with several of the conservation group representatives. And so it started around a lot of different tables before we finally got to one. And as I recall, it was a long rectangular one, but with some creative seating, we got people mixed together who started talking.
We'll talk about that creative seating.
Well, I had in my own mind, after talking with all the groups, I had in my mind which ones I would like to see side by side so that they would have to start talking. And I asked Stacy, who was my daughter-in-law and my assistant through all this, to set up the seats in the right way, and she thought I was a little crazy. She thought maybe we would come to fisticuffs the first time, but I just tried to get people that I knew either shared a real interest in a particular issue or were on opposite sides, really at the poles of an issue, so that the conversation started. And that was my theory, that if we could get people talking, it would eventually work out. I'll admit I didn't think it would take 8 years.
Why were you and your colleagues willing to talk with a conservation group like the Wilderness Society?
I'm tired of standing outside the house throwing rocks at the glass. Okay, that's really where it is. We've been for years just saying no, 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 no. We don't want this. We don't want wilderness. We don't want anything. And until you sit down and you talk with Craig and John Robinson and all the guys that we've been talking with and been involved with this effort, is that really it comes down to that we are conservationists also. Okay, now we're motorized, from ATV to 4x4, everything in between. But we still have a desire to try to maintain something there as far as a resource and not damage it. Okay. Now, we definitely have our own way of doing things. We like to have access and that to keep open. But we need to talk together. We need to work together in getting this collaborative process doing. And we've shown that that's happened. you know. I'm definitely motorized. I like to climb rocks. I like to do all this. You know, I want to go everywhere. At some point in time that I had years ago, I didn't want the likes of Craig Gehrke around either, but you know, but and I'm just being facetious. But the thing is that we need to sit at the same table and we need to work together, and then we've come to something that all can agree. Now, is it the best that we could have done for each individual user group or for the conservation? No, but we all came to a conclusion, though.
And that's your same sense, ranchers sitting down with.
Yeah. Fred doesn't tell the actuals. I was trying to figure out what I had done to make him mad when I had my seating assignment at the first meeting. But
what was it?
Well, it was just between, as Fred said, two people that we had been either in lawsuits with their groups or, you know, extreme opposite poles. But by the end of that lunch, all of a sudden you realize we have so much in common for the end result of the landscape out there, and what we all enjoy is the same thing. We just come about it at a little bit different angle, and it was softening those angles and getting it back to the table, and it was a very rewarding experience. But Fred, he was brilliant in the way of doing that, because we all started talking, and I can honestly say we all come out and we have a very healthy respect for each other's uses. We may not agree on everything and every aspect that our groups represent as outside of this, but for the Owyhees, we are in agreement on moving this forward and making it work for the groups involved.
Okay, let's take some more calls. Ike in Hagerman. Ike, go ahead, please. Ike? Is Ike there still?
Hello.
Hi, go ahead, Ike.
Hi, I'd just like to know what criteria they use to identify cultural sites. I hear that thrown around quite a bit, and I just like to know how we know where they're at.
Okay, cultural sites for the tribe or?
For the tribe, yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, cultural sites is something that we don't share with the public, simply because once we disclose these sites, vandals are attracted to it, pot hunters, and some of the new agers that go in there and change the sites around and
so that's why I wonder how you're going to enforce it, because if you tell somebody not to be there, then they're going to know that this is a valuable area.
Well, I think that's the importance of having tribal people out there, because we know where those sites are. Mm-hmm. We don't have to look on a map to know where they are.
But I mean, if you see somebody in one of those sites, if you tell them not to be there, then they're going to know that that's a...
Well, there are quite a few sites already that are known by a lot of people.
Okay, so you want to keep them... Wait, well, let's talk about some of the other values that you used to decide. One was bighorn sheep and where they are, and that was, you know, not necessarily in the canyons, but up top as well. That was another value that was taken into consideration, was it not?
That's right. We met with Fish and Game folks, we met with BLM, and one of our goals for wilderness was to protect a lot of the bighorn sheep habitat that's down there, and that's where you see some of the boundaries that we picked up, say the plateau country between Little Jacks Creek and Shoofly Creek, for example, that was not recommended for the wilderness by BLM. Some of the country on the Jarbidge was recommended for wilderness, but just in the actual river canyon, and we took the wilderness boundary out and made it larger to pick up, you know, the shoulders going into the canyon, which are more habitat used. And then the area of Dick Shooter Ridge between Deep Creek and Battle Creek is a bighorn sheep area too that we wanted to protect as wilderness.
So that was a big factor in what you chose. And also, a lot of people don't realize, we see the pictures of the canyons and the rivers and everything, but there's juniper forest and mahogany and other plant life that was being tried to be protected up top as well, was there not?
That and sage-grouse habitat, and basically the canyons themselves represent only a small percentage of the landforms that were protected in wilderness. We've got, again, sagebrush plateaus, we've got juniper forests, we've got a lot of grassland protected, and I think that's going to pay dividends into the diversity of the landscape that we tried to capture and can point to say, people worried about sage-grouse, we've just protected tens of thousands of acres of sage-grouse habitat as wilderness.
You mean for the pending listing of sage-grouse? That
discussion, yeah.
That this will show that an effort was made. Okay, let's take some more phone calls. Kevin in Kuna. Kevin, go ahead, please.
Yes, this is Kevin. I'm the director of the Idaho State 4x4 Association, and I wanted to first say that I'm very thankful for all the efforts that have been going on with you and all the groups that have come together to collaborate. And I did have a question for Bill. As a 4x4 enthusiast, do you have some information on how many trails that we currently use have remained open and what the condition is there?
Are there major areas that are going to be closed off that people like Kevin would have wanted to go to?
Well, if there were in wilderness study areas, yes, they're going to be done. There are some in the maps, and Craig, maybe you can help me out here just real quick. There's
Crutches Crossing will still be open.
Yes.
And
Indian Hot Springs Road, which is one that actually crosses the river. And
Crutches Crossing is on this map, as you can see here. And then one thing that will be closed is Gehrke, right? That's in the lower right?
Gehreke's open on the south side of the river, down to the
okay.
river. It's closed on the north side. And I think the one thing the map doesn't show here is that actually, if you look at the Owyhee River Wilderness,
and this is back to the Owyhee River Wilderness map.
A lot of the boundary on the outside of the wilderness is actually along a road.
Okay.
And so, the point being made that, well, and if you can kind of see some of these brown areas going into the wilderness, those are roads that are left open, that were taken out of wilderness. The Dukes V Road, for example, again, Crutchers. The crossing at the South Fork at the 45 Ranch, and then the road on out into Oregon stays open. And then the road down to Wiley stays open. So there's places, and the Little Jacks Creek, the pipeline between Big Jacks and Little Jacks Creek, that pipeline right away stays open. There's a road around through that. So most of the places in Owyhee, in the wilderness here, you'll have access to it.
Wasn't the objective basically to get within a mile or two?
That was one of the things
from a road of any place somebody might want to go?
We had tried to do that. There are places that are further from a road than that, and that's a good point from our standpoint. And we also, what we tried to do was look at roads, I think Bill mentioned this, that have been in use for a very long time. In fact, some of them predated the wilderness inventory. And we thought the roads had been there for that long, we would leave them open.
So where can Kevin go to find out where he can go, essentially? Nobody wants to break the law, but this is a very confusing thing because these roads have spidered out over time. So how will people know where they can go?
Well,
the BLM put out a map, or?
Well, they eventually will, and that's the legislation requires that the BLM go in and take an inventory and then make these designations as routes.
But for now, even though the law has been passed, can they still go where they want to go?
No.
Okay.
It would be the best maps at this point are on Senator Crapo's website.
On Senator Crapo's website. And we're linked to that on our website.
They will lack some detail. It will take the BLM some time to get maps produced.
Okay, yeah, there we go. If you want to go to our website, go to idahoptv.org, click on dialogue, and it'll link you to Senator Crapo's maps. And then the BLM will have another map out. Thank you very much. Let's go to Tammy in Middleton. Tammy, go ahead, please.
Hi. Hey, I have a couple of comments and then a quick question. I think my comment is just, this has been an amazing process, and to see all these stakeholders be able to come together on with such diverse viewpoints is really amazing. And I guess with all the issues across Idaho, the aquifer issues in the Magic Valley area and the immigration issues, and how can we apply this process to these other issues and get these stakeholders to the table? I wonder if Fred has any ideas about that.
Thank you very much for the question. How can this be used for all types of issues, not just land management issues? What would be your advice?
Well, I spoke to the Coalition of Forest Counties and School Districts in Reno last weekend and suggested to them that they should be looking at this rather than go back each year asking for forest receipts appropriations. And several of those counties decided that they're going to sit down and start to work on it. The process is simply a process. It's a process of getting people together who are willing to sit down and discuss and who are willing to make compromises. If at the beginning, if you're not willing to compromise, you're just wasting time.
And some people did drop out of this group.
They dropped out, but their interest was still represented. All of our interests stayed at the table.
But what if there's just such animosity? She mentions the immigration issue.
Well, I don't think that there could be any greater animosity than some that we started with 8 years ago. I think that I remember the night that we were demonstrating, if you can put it that way, against the monument proposal that would have taken half the county. There were some pretty harsh words said that night. I think that the things that we said and that we did in court and out of court were about as strong as some of the issues in immigration.
Did you have to have a unanimous vote for anything to move forward? How did that work?
We had to work by consensus. That's the way we started off, and it was late in the game before we decided that where consensus couldn't be reached, then a supermajority would decide. But we were well past the agreement by the time we did that.
And I know, and one person who's not at this table, John McCarthy, spent a lot of time just simply walking and talking with ranchers and making relationships, building relationships.
Yes. I think that was one of the biggest aspects. And in answer to Tammy's question, it's the ability to keep an open mind and realize that there's other aspects out there. We didn't agree on everything, but we had respect for the things we could disagree on, and we moved forward. And when it got to the point where maybe we weren't making progress, we needed to pull out those initial aspects and remind ourselves what the end product was, and it was preserving the resource out there and the heritage and that aspect for generations to come. And I think that's probably more than anything, as Fred would remind us, is what's the end goal here? And that would be out of any of your coalitions. What is the end goal that you're working towards?
Thank you very much, Ted Howard. There must be much in tribal culture that builds on this form of talking together.
Well, the one thing with the tribes, Fred mentioned the monument designation. You know, the tribes weren't happy with that either, because that was going to open the Canyonlands for tourism. But the thing with the tribes is we really don't have a choice. This is where the Creator put us. This is our homeland. So no matter what happens out there, we have to find some survivability in it. And I think we're really fortunate to be able to come together. And I commend everyone that played a part in there, especially Senator Crapo and Fred and some of the key players, Craig, you guys that's been in it for a long time. And well, this is the first of its kind. This has never happened anywhere before.
Within tribal country as well, you think?
That's correct.
Okay. Let's talk to Paul and Burley. Paul, go ahead, please.
Hi. I haven't caught the whole program. My question is this. I keep hearing it's a wilderness study area. Number two, I'd like to know, is there a difference between that and the wilderness designation? And
sure.
And also, my question is this. I keep hearing we need to protect this, or we are going to protect this. I would like somebody to clarify.
Sure.
What is the difference that's going to be made by the study that's going to take place?
Well, actually, a law has been passed. We'll put the big map up again because I think that it's helpful to do that, Paul. And actually, these areas were wilderness study areas for many, many years, for decades. They are no longer. What this law did is actually make permanent wilderness in the dark green areas. In the yellow areas that you see are withdrawn from wilderness study. And Craig, define what happens in a wilderness and a wild and scenic area. There's certain things that can't happen anymore.
Yeah, basically in the designated wilderness areas are be managed for non-motorized, will be looked at, trying to be managed to protect the wilderness values, which translates to protect how they are right today. We're not going to be trying to take them back to some pre-Columbian condition here, but it's like we've seen in other, like the Sawtooth Wilderness or the Frank Church.
So what was wilderness study and has now turned into wilderness will be managed the same way.
Yeah.
What was withdrawn in those yellow areas will now be available for multiple use, and that's why you're saying your groups are supportive, because it opens up some more areas.
And the ranchers too, because it was more difficult to graze in wilderness study areas than it is in wilderness.
Right, so this removes some of the consternation. I hope that answers your question. We're rapidly running out of time, but I want to get a question in from Mary in Homedale. Mary, go ahead, please.
Hi, this is Mary from Homedale. I have a quick question. What about people that likes to rock hound that doesn't belong to a gem club? Would we be able to still rock hound for fun?
Certain areas?
That's a good question. Usually what happens when there's a wilderness management plan developed, they look at that question and decide what's appropriate for recreational gem collecting like that. I know the Sawtooth Wilderness talked about that with the quartz crystals up there. So right now, that'll be developed for each area where there's been that activity happen before, and they'll look at that and see whether does that protect the wilderness resources to allow that to keep going on.
So it sounds like it's a TBA. Mary, you're going to have to watch as the BLM develops the plans for this area as to where rock hounders can go.
Okay, great.
So thank you so much for your question. I know there's a lot of people out there that do that, and one of my first trips into this area was with the rock hounder, and my goodness, that road was rough. As we wrap up, one of the things we haven't really talked about is that this bill also authorizes a research center and a scientific review panel. And some have, criticized that as all for the ranchers. It's going to review grazing allotments. What are these two entities about? This center and
the science review is separate from the research center, and the science review doesn't benefit just ranchers. Any use out there that where there is an adverse decision from the BLM that the user believes is not based on
like
sound
rock hounding,
science.
maybe even?
Well, any of the uses
4x4 use.
4x4 use.
They can ask for a review, and there will be a panel selected, a panel of experts selected by this board of directors, and from that panel, 3 people will be selected to study the BLM decision and decide whether or not, in their view, it was based on sound science. They're not dictating to the BLM. It's not turning over the decision of the BLM. But that decision will be put in the administrative record.
And why was it important to have this?
Because an administrative judge often has only one side of the issue before him on an appeal, and to have these experts who are non-agency people and not related to the rancher, not related to the user, not related to the agency, making their decision and going in the administrative review allows the administrative judge to see an objective view of whether sound science was used.
And very briefly, what will the Science Center administered, I think, by the University of Idaho, if that gets funded, what will that be about?
Science Center is hopefully going to take a landscape level view of a lot of the issues out there. Like there's a lot of work going on sage grouse right now. There's a lot of work going on weed control. There's a lot of work going on, juniper burning. It's the idea of trying to get a big picture and bring a lot of those folks working on that together, so we don't have kind of different efforts going on at the same time, but nobody's really talking to each other.
Do you all consider each other friends now?
You bet.
Yep.
Definitely.
And I know that you have actually likened this to kind of the drafting of the Constitution and the.
Well, that's taking away from these folks when you compare the what they had at stake as to the people who were putting the Constitution together. They didn't have anything to lose. These folks did, and so I do compare it to that. I think that this worked because of some very unique people who were on the work group, now the board of directors by law. And I think it was them and their personalities and their willingness to work hundreds of hours that made this work.
And from here, you work on the money piece?
From here, the money piece, as well as implementation with the BLM through memorandums of agreement with regard to how the science review will work and all the other parts, including the cultural protection plan.
Well, we can see the credits rolling. We're out of time. Thank you so much for joining me to discuss the Owyhee Initiative. I really appreciate it. You've been listening to another edition of Dialogue. We hope you'll join us same time next week.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho. To order a copy of this program from Idaho Public Television, call our toll-free number or visit us on the World Wide Web